In a few moments, I will sign a historic executive order instituting reciprocal tariffs on countries throughout the world. Reciprocal, that means they do it to us and we do it to them. Very simple. Can't get any simpler than that.
Well, on fresh tracks, Trump has officially declared a national state of emergency in foreign trade. However, some senators, mostly Democrats, disagree with this. However, even a couple of Republicans have been found. They are trying to vote for the abolition of Trump's emergency powers, so far without success. But Trump needs emergency powers to impose tariffs, as the chronic U.S. trade deficit, according to him, is no longer just an economic issue. It's a full-blown national emergency. And it's true. The cost of goods that the United States imports is much higher than those that it exports. The country has become more dependent on imports than it can afford. For example, on the eve of Liberation Day, the U.S. trade deficit was historic. And in the coming days, from April 5th to April 9th, manufacturers expect the largest weekly trade deficit in the history of the United States. Trump considers this situation to be critical and is therefore taking drastic measures to impose tariffs immediately against 185 countries. This is one of the largest tariff wars in the history of the United States. And the markets didn't like it. The S&P 500 lost $2 trillion in less than 15 minutes. But Bitcoin is holding up much better. In fact, we are just trampling in this corridor where we have found new support and new resistance. We even bounced off the support line of the entire bull run. Right here, as you can see. During all this bull run, it was the main support. We've been going back to it several times already. Apparently, even the large tariffs on China, the European Union, Vietnam, Taiwan, Japan, and other countries, ranging from 20 to 49%, are no longer impressive for Bitcoin. But how were these reciprocal tariffs calculated? Trump said that because the United States is very kind, the tariffs will be imposed at half the rate that countries currently charge the United States. For example, if a country sets a tariff of 20% on United States goods, the United States will set a tariff of only 10% for it. The White House has also left out some categories of goods subject to tariff exemptions, such as copper, medicines, semiconductors, wood products, and, of course, energy. Trump also announced tax breaks, the largest in American history. The base tariff of 10% for all countries will be effective from April 5th, and individual reciprocal, higher tariffs will enter into force on April 9th. The tariffs will remain in effect until Trump makes sure that the chronic trade deficit no longer threatens the United States. But why is Trump so kind all of a sudden? Is there such altruism from nowhere that it will only charge half of the tariffs that other countries have imposed on America? First of all, the 34% that Trump is imposing on China is actually turning into 54%, since China has already had tariffs of 20%. So that's 34% over what it was. This means that the final tariff is 54%, and this is confirmed by U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent.
The reciprocal tariff, China has this 34% tariff. There were already 20% tariffs in place on China. So is that 34% on top of that, meaning it's a 54% reciprocal tariff on China?
I believe it is.
Okay.
The most interesting thing is the formula for calculating these tariffs. Trump used trade deficit data to determine the size of the tariff rather than the actual import duties that other countries have imposed on the United States. And this leads for the most part to higher tariff rates than they actually are. That is, the United States of America did not take the tariff rate of other countries and did not introduce half of it. They took the trade deficit with a particular country, divided it by imports from that particular country, and multiplied it by 100%. And they got like 67%. For example, for China, 67% divided by 2 is already 34%. That's how they calculated it all, and that's how they got all these tariffs that they impose on other countries. This is what these calculations look like for the rest of the countries: Vietnam, Taiwan, Japan, and the European Union. And it turns out that these are not tariffs that other countries have imposed against the United States, but numbers derived from this formula. And already from this number, Trump took half as a friendly gesture. This is a big deception that will have consequences. Well, the consequences are already coming. The European Union is preparing further retaliatory measures against the recently announced tariffs of 20% by the United States, CNBC reports. For example, officials are discussing the introduction of barriers to the import of American services. Exactly services, not goods. How can they do this? Well, for example, by imposing taxes on Netflix, Google, and Apple, or introducing strict regulations that would complicate their business. However, the European Union leaves room for negotiations, and these countermeasures will be taken only if the negotiations fail. The Vietnamese government is also holding emergency meetings. Previously, this country has already tried to mitigate the effects of the U.S. tariff war by reducing its own tariffs on the United States. For example, they reduced duties on cars from 64% to 32% and on ethanol from 10% to 5%. However, this did not help much, and in return they received 46% of the duty from the United States. And finally, the most important player says that the tariffs of the U.S. trade war threaten the global economy. China promises to strike back and launch large-scale countermeasures to paralyze the U.S. economy and promote Beijing's role abroad. China has its own tools for this. For example, they can artificially weaken or devalue the yuan. This is a topic for a separate video. Of course, the United States has something to respond to this, and the trade war between the world's two largest economies will flare up even more, which will only be a negative effect for global financial stability and markets. Against this background, China is looking for a company to spend time with, and this company is very amazing. South Korea, China, and Japan are agreeing to cooperate to conduct comprehensive high-level talks to improve free trade in the region amid concerns over Trump's tariffs. Some people correctly point out that it took a lot of effort to get these three countries with a 1,000-year history of resentment and violence to come to the table with such a common goal. Perhaps Donald Trump is the president of the world after all, as he wanted. Well, since we're lost in this region of the world anyway, let's discuss countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and all the others that are just below. They now have the highest duties from Trump. At the same time, Latin American countries have only a base rate of 10%. To me, this is a simple and clear message from Trump. Bring production back to the United States, or at least to the Western Hemisphere. This is what the President of the United States wants to achieve. After all, the return of the U.S. manufacturing base back to its homeland is of strategic importance for America, and I think this is also a matter of national security, which Donald Trump talks about so often, and for which he is ready to crush entire countries. However, if the United States really wants to reindustrialize, and it needs to do so, it needs a real industrial policy. A clear state-led development plan that will include large public investments in infrastructure, education, training, industrial modernization, and relaxation of rules and regulations. Trump is not doing any of this, but on the contrary, he is combining the economy with comprehensive tariffs. Analysts are already saying that this could raise inflation. For example, UBS, the largest Swiss investment bank, forecasts an increase in inflation in the United States to 5%. Against this background, the Federal Bank of Atlanta lowered its forecast for U.S. GDP for the first quarter of 2025. Now their forecast is negative 3.7%. And notice how much they've been worsening their forecast over the past month. On March 1st, they predicted a 1.5% contraction in the economy. On March 28th, it was 2.8%. And finally, on April 1st, their forecast was 3.7%. As a result, the largest banks predict a drop in US GDP and an increase in inflation at the same time. All this leads to the fact that the yield on 10-year Treasury bonds fell to 4% in early April 2025. This is the lowest level since October last year. This indicates that investors are afraid of a recession, or inflation, or maybe both. That's why they run into bonds. And this leads to the fact that we are seeing the first signs of an inversion of yields on 2-year and 10-year bonds. Historically, a recession begins after an inversion reversal, not during it. Why is this inversion happening? Because financial markets expect that the U.S. Federal Reserve will soon be forced to sharply lower rates, which only happens in the event of a crisis or recession. It seems that President Trump and Treasury Secretary Bessent are not opposed to a recession for the sake of lowering interest rates. And Powell's cautious and hard data-oriented stance leaves them with no choice. We need to get Powell to lower the stakes, and in order to do this, it is necessary that the hard data is bad for him. At the same time, it should be borne in mind that the reduction in inflated government spending and loan expansion over the years has probably not yet affected the market. This is the opinion of investor Danny Moses, whom many people know from the movie The Big Short. However, Trump and Bessent don't seem to care about the market at all. Trump doesn't look at the stock market at all and says that tariffs will make the United States very strong.
No, nothing to do with the market. I'm not even looking at the market because long term, the United States will be very strong with what's happening here.
You just have to be patient. And Bessent called the market decline a problem of companies from the Magnificent Seven, not the Republican Party. Apparently, they decided to ignore short-term pain for the sake of long-term profits and do everything so that this rate finally drops. And here we see a technical head and shoulders chart pattern, which usually indicates a trend reversal. We may see a drop to 3.5% here anyway. Both Trump and Bessent, oddly enough, are right. We need short-term pain, and we will have to endure it. Therefore, there remains only one logical question. Will Trump be able to successfully complete his experiment or not? The reporter asks, the Trump trade and tariff team is confident that all of this will work, but what if they're wrong? The White House responds, they won't make a mistake, it will work. In the meantime, U.S. households are sitting in stocks at a record high, and the question arises, won't this generation become a new lost generation as it was here and here when we were at the same levels? And household investments in American stocks, S&P 500, also hint at another crisis like the coronavirus or dot-coms. And Bitcoin is wondering exactly how to close this April. We need this pink line to return above the black one. Because as you can see, when it went lower and did not come back, it led to the fact that the price of Bitcoin reached a peak. Therefore, April will be a very important month. But by the way, Bitcoin looks pretty strong considering what's going on. Let me just remind you that fear and greed, which are currently at their peak, cause millions of people to lose money every year in the stock market, which has been growing almost continuously for 2 decades. An example is the S&P 500. But this is also very, very true for Bitcoin. At each such drop, millions of people said, everything is bad. This is a recession. Collapse is near. Bitcoin will be zero. This is the apocalypse. This is the end of Bitcoin. It repeats over and over again. And even these tariffs are far from a new story. There have been at least 3 such large-scale tariff wars in the United States in 1828, 1930, and 2025. As you can see, they happen almost once every 100 years. And each time there were significant economic and political consequences. But what unites them is that the crises they provoked created a huge number of very rich families. The names of people who bought stocks very, very cheaply from those who panicked or sold just to survive. And I'm talking about surnames, not individuals. After all, they were no longer even doing this for themselves, but for their family, for their children, and to continue their family name. And on Bitcoin, we overcame it every time too. Bitcoin has overcome it every time. Of course, if we compare with 2022, we still have room to fall. The S&P 500 then fell by 25%, and now it is only 10. Bitcoin then fell by 77%, from $69,000 to $15,500. It has now dropped by only 23%, from $109,000 to $83,000. Therefore, yes, I am cautious in the short and medium term, but in the long term, I am optimistic about the future of Bitcoin. Therefore, I am glad to accumulate it again with a discount of 25% and up to 75%. Although 75% I think is unlikely, because if it drops by 75% from current levels, it will bring its price to $20,000. It seems unlikely to me, but I'll be glad if I'm wrong, because accumulating Bitcoin from $20,000 to $75,000 is a complete happiness for me. And I want to share with you this chart, which is a chart of maximum risk and maximum opportunity for Bitcoin. And as you can see, we haven't reached the point of maximum opportunity yet, but most likely we have already passed the point of maximum risk. This is a very useful chart for long-term investments, for patient investors, and those who have the patience always win.